What is that? Sounds like...
The medium sets itself apart from other horror games immediately. Firstly, in a unique fixed camera angle that harkens back to the days of PlayStation horror games, and also in its headline-grabbing dual reality mechanic that splits the game in half between the spirit world and the ordinary. The game starts off with a classic setup. The protagonist, Marianne, receives a mysterious call from a panicked man begging her to help him at the spooky, haunted Neva Hotel Resort. With little hesitation, she thrusts herself out into the spooky woods surrounding the hotel, and things quickly get supernatural.
What the? Hello? Thomas?
The game is essentially a very basic point-and-click adventure, with the artistic benefit of rendering real-time 3D backgrounds instead of the classic pre-rendered backgrounds found in the games it's inspired from. The environments themselves were absolutely lovely and befitting of a game that is also a debut exclusive on the Xbox Series X. The game lets itself down a bit with its characters though. Whilst the textures of characters are undeniably jaw-droppingly detailed, the facial animations shatter the realism pretty quickly. All characters in the game animate like inflexible puppets, which is perhaps alleviated by the fact that a lot of the ghost characters on the journey wear masks to cover their faces the entire time. The animations carry over to the walking, which funnily enough reminds me of the disconnect between early horror games' 3D characters and their 2D backgrounds. If this is intentional, I don't particularly agree with this direction. It removes some of the benefit of having a 3D world to move around in. In the early game, you won't be moving around a lot either. The game funnels you through literal corridors for a long time, with Marianne refusing to even walk through certain areas if there's still something that needs to be done in a room prior.
No. Nuh-uh. No.
I appreciate why Bloober Team have done this. It's to stop the player from wasting time in rooms they don't have to be in, accentuated by the slow character movement. But a lot of modern horror games have grown out of this practice, organically guiding the player through where they're supposed to go, without having to use frustrating and visible walls and quest markers. Quest markers do exist in this game in the form of a butterfly trail that often points you to the exact right location. While I got confused, this obviously did help, but I stand by saying that a player shouldn't need such strict hand-holding in an already extremely linear game. I found the camera angle to be overall more of a hindrance throughout the game. It falls into a trap of frequently disorientating the player when walking around large rooms when the camera suddenly snaps to a new position. There are plenty of times throughout the game where I was getting frustrated losing which direction I was in. It's certainly not all bad though. I really did appreciate the artistry that the game achieves by fixing the camera. The benefits of a fixed camera is that the developer is able to show exactly what they want them to see, and gives the beautiful environments the grandiose presentation they so often deserve. Chase scenes were more dramatic, dark basements more dank, giant structures more grand. It makes the game feel almost cinematic at times. Speaking of cinematic, the 24 frames per second cinema standard is what you'll be faced with regardless of your hardware. For my build, my GPU was always working at 99%, so it appears to be a GPU centric game, as most games are. I was not ready for how much the game chugs. When in non-split reality mode, the game runs at what I would say is an unacceptable rate, considering the game is a very tight, linear world. But that goes out of the window when splitting the screen. Certain cutscenes ran way below 30 FPS for me, and during gameplay frequently stayed around in the mid-20s. Going back to single view mode would triple that frame rate. The game simply does not look good enough to warrant this kind of performance. For reference, I ran the game on an RTX 2070 at 1440p at high settings. I had DLSS on medium, which means the game is natively rendering at something around 720p and upscaling it. I also had the resolution setting in the game set to 70%, which, by the game's description and my understanding, means I'm in fact targeting something more like 1200p. I don't know what the game's specific implementation of DLSS is well enough to make any precise claims, but I definitely know that the game should be easier to run than this. Whilst on the topic of RTX features, this game also supports ray tracing. From what I can tell, it only enables ray trace reflections. To the game's credit, the hit on the frame rate that the ray tracing affects is fairly small, and the reflections do look good. After a lot of experimentation, I ended up leaving it off though. Mainly because of what seems to be a fairly game-breaking bug that only occurs with ray tracing on. It happens when you open the inventory. The game just goes into meltdown. So, rendering the game twice hits the performance hard. That's hardly surprising. But how does it affect the gameplay? At its best, the split screen is a very unique, one-of-a-kind function that was really interesting to play. Seeing the same world, but split into two different dimensions, was always really interesting. I feared that the spirit world wouldn't look so different to the real world, but there's actually an enormous difference, with certain aspects of each reality just not existing in the other. This isn't just visual spectacle. Often Marianne will only be able to interact with objects in one of the worlds, meaning you have to keep an eye on both realities at the same time. If anything, the game doesn't really ever live up to the full potential that the mechanic brings. There are only a small handful of what I would say were really clever moments when the screen split pays off as it should. Most of the game is spent in one of the two realities though, and I think this is where the game is at its best. In certain areas, the game opens up a bit more and lets you shift from one world to the other by interacting with mirrors that instantly take you to the other world without a loading screen. These sections are when the best puzzles can be found, as certain ledges and doors only exist in one of the worlds, so you have to carefully plan when to use a mirror or not. It's still extremely linear, but the game doesn't hold your hand as much in these areas, and it's all the better for it. You are also able to astrally project yourself outside of your body at times in order to pass through an area which is closed in the real world but open in the ghost world. Marianne is only able to stay astrally projected for a short period of time, which adds urgency to some of the puzzle solving. Other actions include a force field shield and the ability to unleash a wave of ghostly energy on certain objects. These both require you to charge up at a well of ghostly energy, which are only present in selective areas. This game has horror elements though, remember? And this manifests as a terrifying monster voiced by Troy Baker, which will stalk you every so often in simple cover stealth gameplay that occasionally shakes up the atmosphere. Overall, I didn't find the game particularly scary, but it's definitely creepy for sure. So what this all amounts to is an endgame area that builds on all of the mechanics slowly given to you throughout the game. It's unfortunate really that the endgame puzzles feel like they've just reached a good level of difficulty, but then the game just ends. There are glimmers of some really inventive use of the game's mechanics, with one puzzle and one monster encounter coming to mind that show real promise. But these glimpses of brilliance are extremely fleeting. Too often, puzzles are extremely simple. Objects that need to be found are located only a metre away from the scenery that requires it. It's not that the game is that short, particularly at the price point the game is being sold at, but I feel like the puzzle intensity should have ramped up much quicker, much earlier in the game. So the puzzles can sometimes be inventive and clever, but are often mundane and easy. But what will really pull you through the game, more than its slightly tired gameplay loop, is its story and characters. I've been careful not to spoil the story for you in this review, as the story has some great twists and turns and characters I did not expect to appear in the game. The setting is interesting, the voice acting is superb, and the story is very dark. There's a decent number of optional files, books and entries to read as you progress through the game, providing you with more tidbits of lore without being too overbearing. It's really unfortunate then that Just like the puzzles, the story seems to just start to get into a rhythm and then it ends quite abruptly. The game is very clearly setting itself up for a sequel, which is fine, but the game could have done with one more mission to make the game feel complete on its own without the obvious requirements for a second game. So the medium is definitely interesting. When the credits rolled, I couldn't help but feel like this game was a couple of chapters in the story, both through the story and gameplay wise. The mechanics of the game as a bedrock are very interesting, but there's so much more that could have been done with it. The characters are really interesting, but it feels like there's so much more the game could have given you. I'm divided on the fixed camera. I wouldn't mind seeing it return in a sequel, but it needs to be used cleverly without some of the more disorientating switching the game employs. I hope for and expect there to be a sequel. And if you have Xbox Games Pass, I would strongly recommend you give this game a go. At full price though, it's a bit of a hard sell. Maybe wait for a confirmation of a sequel and a sale.
I felt lost. I came to Neva looking for answers, and all I got was more questions.